There is a saying on my homeworld, Voritha Prime, that translates roughly like this. You can measure the intelligence of a civilization by how it treats the things it considers beneath it. I used to think that was wisdom. Now I think it was just something we told ourselves, so we didn't have to feel guilty about what we did to the humans. Let me tell you about Marcus Webb. He was the man who swept the floors of the Galactic Convergence Station, the most powerful diplomatic hub in the known Spiral Arm, and for 3 years, nobody knew his real name. We called him things: janitor, servant class, the human, the floor polisher. Station Administrator Drail 9 called him the bipedal maintenance unit in official logs. I remember reading those logs and not thinking twice about the terminology. That's the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. We didn't think twice. Marcus had been assigned to the Convergence Station as part of the Galactic Accord's Human Integration Pilot Program, one of those political gestures that nobody on the Galactic Council actually believed in, but everybody voted for because it looked good on the record. The idea was simple enough: bring a small number of humans into non-combat, non-decision-making roles across galactic facilities. Show the Outer Rim colonies that the Council was open to emerging species. Give humans a chance to demonstrate civilizational readiness. In practice, what it meant was this: humans cleaned things, humans carried things. Humans fixed small mechanical problems that weren't important enough to bother a Vorithan engineer with. Humans smiled at visiting dignitaries and were told not to speak unless spoken to, and even then, to keep their answers short. Marcus Webb swept floors, and he did it with a quietness that I now recognize as something else entirely. Not submission, not defeat, not the broken spirit of a lesser species learning its place. He was watching. He was learning. We just didn't have the eyes to see it. I first noticed him in the 3rd rotation of the Keltharan Treaty negotiations. I was a junior aide at the time, barely 2 decades past my secondary emergence, assigned to logistics coordination for the Vorithan delegation. My job was mostly fetching data slates and making sure the senior delegates had their atmospheric processors calibrated correctly, which meant I spent a lot of time in corridors. And Marcus was always in the corridors. He had this pushcart, a long, low cleaning apparatus that hummed softly as it moved across the station's luminite flooring. He'd guide it with one hand, almost absent-mindedly, while his eyes moved. That's the thing I remember most vividly about those early months. The cart moved like something bored, something mechanical. But his eyes were doing something else. He watched the Keltharans when they argued about jurisdiction parameters. He watched the Drazari envoy's body language during the recess periods. He watched the security rotations of the interspecies peacekeeping force stationed at the station's 4 main gates. He watched everything. I assumed he was just curious, the way a lower animal might be curious about the movements of larger creatures. Instinct, pattern recognition, basic survival behavior. I was wrong about that too. The Convergence Station itself is worth describing, because you need to understand the scale of what we're talking about to understand what happened later. Picture a structure roughly the size of a small moon, not a planet, but close enough that it has its own gravitational stabilizers running on 6 independent power cores. The outer shell is dramite alloy, dense enough to absorb a sustained Tier 4 weapons barrage without significant structural compromise. The interior is divided into 47 administrative sectors, 12 diplomatic suites, 9 cultural exchange pavilions, a central conference hall that seats 3,000 delegates simultaneously, and a network of service corridors that runs through the whole thing like veins through a body. That corridor network was Marcus's world. He knew every junction, every access panel, every maintenance shaft, every emergency bypass route between the atmospheric processing units on sublevel 3 and the central power distribution hub on sublevel 7. He knew which sections of the luminite flooring were thinner than standard, older construction, pre-renovation, and vibrated differently when large equipment moved overhead. He knew which ventilation grills fed into which conference rooms. He knew everything about the station that nobody thought was worth knowing. For 3 years, Marcus Webb swept his floors, attended his assigned maintenance briefings, ate his meals in the human-designated service canteen on sublevel 2, and was largely invisible. And in those 3 years, the Galactic Council made several decisions that would come back to haunt them. The Vreth hegemony had been a problem for about a decade. Not a civilizational threat kind of problem, not yet, not in the way the Council officially classified threats. More of a persistent, uncomfortable problem. The kind you keep in a diplomatic holding pattern because confronting it directly would require resources and political courage that nobody wanted to spend. The Vreth were a warrior species from the outer spiral, large, multi-limbed, with a hierarchical culture built around the concept of Gretikal, which translates as something between dominance inheritance and might defines right. They had expanded aggressively through 12 star systems in 40 years, incorporating weaker species through what they called protective assimilation, and what the incorporated species called something that doesn't translate well into Vorathan, but means approximately the end of everything we were. They were also, critically, not technically violating any existing Galactic Accord statutes, because the statutes had been written by species who never imagined something quite like the Vreth would show up and find the loopholes. 3 years ago, the Vreth hegemony had formally requested observer status at the Convergence Station. The Council granted it, because, again, it looked good on the record. I remember the day the Vreth delegation arrived. 7 of them came through the main docking bay on Sector 1, all of them massive, even by non-human standards. The Vreth are roughly bipedal but built on a completely different scale. 3 meters tall at the shoulder, with 4 upper limbs and 2 primary locomotion limbs, covered in overlapping plates of natural chitin that run from deep gray at the joints to almost black along the spine. Their faces are, I don't want to say monstrous because that's a culturally loaded term, but they are built for intimidation. Broad, flat, with jaw structures that can exert pressure measured in the tens of thousands of standard force units. They arrived in full ceremonial armor, technically against station protocol, but nobody stopped them. I watched from the logistics bay as they moved through the receiving corridor. The interspecies peacekeeping force sentinels on either side of the corridor, Keltharans mostly with 2 Drazari observers, did not move. But I noticed their secondary defensive positions shift very slightly. An unconscious response, the body knowing things the mind hadn't processed yet. The Vreth delegation leader was called Vreth Commander Gorthakin Maul. He was the largest of the 7. He looked at the receiving corridor, at the diplomatic art installations on the walls, at the flags of member species hanging from the ceiling, at the assembled welcoming committee of junior aides and protocol officers, and he smiled. The Vreth smile is not like other species' smiles. It involves the jaw plates spreading wide and the inner bioluminescent organs behind the eyes brightening to a cold blue light. It is not a warm expression. Small, Gorthakin Maul said, just that one word in galactic standard. His translator unit rendered it perfectly. He meant the station. He meant all of us. He meant the whole civilizational project of the Galactic Council. Then his gaze moved to the side of the corridor and stopped. Marcus was there against the wall, his cleaning cart parked to one side, waiting for the delegation to pass so he could finish polishing the section of floor they were standing on. He was wearing his standard service uniform, gray, unadorned, with a small yellow accord patch on his left shoulder that identified him as maintenance personnel. Gorthakin Maul stared at him for a long moment. "What is that?" he asked. Station Administrator Drail 9, who was leading the welcoming committee, said, "A human, service personnel. They are part of the integration program." Gorthakin Maul made a sound that his translator rendered as something between a laugh and a dismissal. "A pet," he said. "You have given the station a pet." And then the delegation moved on. And Marcus went back to polishing the floor. I watched him for a second after that. His expression hadn't changed at all. His movements hadn't changed. He just kept working, like the whole thing had rolled off him like water. I told myself he hadn't understood the insult. The Vreth delegation's first week at the station was technically uneventful. Technically, in practice, the 7 Vreth moved through the station in ways that were designed to establish hierarchy and test boundaries. They walked in the center of corridors rather than to the side. They spoke at volumes that disrupted nearby meetings. They made pointed observations in Vreth dialect. Their translator units were slow to render the comments. giving a convenient delay about the physical inadequacies of various council species they passed. They did nothing that constituted a formal violation. They were very good at that. On the fourth day, 2 junior members of the delegation cornered a Drazari cultural liaison in the Pavilion 3 waiting area and engaged in what they described as informal dominance evaluation, standing very close, speaking very loudly, making repeated physical contact in the form of what looked like friendly shoulder grips, but which the Drazari liaison later described as involving enough pressure to bruise chitin. A report was filed. A formal inquiry was considered. Nothing happened. Marcus saw it. He was in Pavilion 3 that day, restocking the atmospheric filter units along the west wall. He was maybe 15 meters from the interaction, close enough. I know he saw it because I was there, at the far end of the pavilion, trying to locate a misfiled data packet in the wing's administrative terminal, and I watched his reaction. His hands stopped moving on the filter unit. Just for a second, maybe 2 seconds. He watched the Drazari liaison, watched the 2 Vreth, watched the way the Drazari's body language was communicating something that didn't need a translator, distress, submission, the controlled panic of a prey animal trying not to trigger a predator's pursuit instinct. Then Marcus's hands started moving again. He finished with the filter unit, pushed his cart to the next station, and kept working. But before he moved on, I noticed something small. He looked at the emergency communication panel on the wall beside him. Just a glance. 2 seconds. Then he looked back at the Vreth, and I could see him doing something with his eyes, not just looking, but measuring. Distance, angles, the weight distribution of the larger Vreth, the positioning of the door behind them. I didn't know what I was seeing. Now I do. He was running threat assessments. In his head in 2 seconds, while pretending to restock atmospheric filter units, Marcus Webb was running the kind of tactical calculations that the interspecies peacekeeping force runs with dedicated processing hardware and a 3-person analysis team, and filing the results away. Waiting. The 3rd week brought the formal observer status hearings. This is when things started to fracture. The Vreth delegation had submitted a formal position paper arguing that their observer status should be upgraded to provisional membership, which would give them voting rights on Accord expansion decisions. The legal basis was thin, almost transparently thin, but it was constructed carefully enough that dismantling it required significant political capital. What nobody on the council had accounted for was what the Vreth intended to do if their application was denied. What nobody had bothered to find out was that the Vreth hegemony had positioned a war fleet, 17 capital ships, 43 escort vessels, over 200 fighter-class craft, in holding pattern at the outer edge of the Convergence Station's defensive perimeter. This was technically legal under the Observer Protocol, which had been drafted in a more optimistic era and didn't include provisions for what you might call diplomatic negotiation by implied orbital threat. The Council found out about the fleet on the morning of the 3rd week's formal session. The response was, well, controlled panic is the polite term. I was in the logistics coordination room when the alert came through. I watched Administrator Drail 9 receive the report on his data slate and go very still in the particular way that Vorathan administrators go still when they are processing information that does not fit their existing models of how situations are supposed to develop. Options, he said quietly, to nobody in particular. There were 14 people in that room. Senior aides, protocol officers, 2 communication specialists. Nobody answered immediately. Then one of the communication specialists said, very carefully, the peacekeeping force garrison here is rated for internal security operations, not fleet engagement. I know that, Drail 9 said. The nearest Council military response unit is 11 days out at standard transit. I know that too. Silence. What nobody said but everyone understood was the 3rd part of the equation. The Vreth fleet wasn't there to attack. Not yet. It was there to make a point. The point was this: you will give us what we want, or the conversation becomes a different kind of conversation. And the Galactic Council, which had spent 40 years building a diplomatic framework on the assumption that all parties wanted to maintain it, had no good answer for a party that didn't. The formal session that afternoon was the worst kind of performance. All the right diplomatic language, all the right procedural movements, and underneath it, everyone in that hall trying to calculate how much they could give the Vreth without losing everything, and whether that was even still an option. Gorthak and Maul sat at the observer's table and said very little. He didn't need to. The fleet spoke for him. I was in the observation gallery above the main hall. My job that afternoon was tracking delegate attendance and flagging any protocol irregularities for Administrator Drail 9 report. About 40 minutes into the session, I noticed something below me in the gallery's maintenance corridor. A figure moving along the service walkway that ran behind the observation windows. The walkway is used by maintenance staff to access the atmospheric control units for the main hall without disrupting sessions. It was Marcus. He was moving differently than I had ever seen him move. The cleaning cart was gone. He was carrying a small tool satchel, standard maintenance issue, nothing remarkable, but his posture was different. His head was up. His eyes were doing that thing again, the measuring thing, but faster now, covering the whole hall below in quick systematic sweeps. He stopped at a particular junction on the walkway and crouched down, opening an access panel in the floor. Inside the panel was a bundle of the station's primary relay conduits, the nervous system of the hall's communication network. He studied them for a long moment. He took out a small diagnostic tool and swept it along the conduit bundle. Then he reached into his satchel and took out something that I did not immediately recognize. It was small, flat, about the size of my hand, dark gray. He placed it carefully against the conduit bundle and closed the access panel. Then he stood up and kept moving along the walkway. I stared at the spot where he had been for a long time. Then I went back to tracking delegate attendance, because I didn't know what else to do with what I had just seen, and I was afraid of what the answer might be if I asked. 3 things happened over the next 72 hours that, taken separately, seemed unrelated. First, the Vreth delegation escalated their demands. The provisional membership application was expanded to include territorial recognition of their 12 absorbed star systems, and a formal council endorsement of their protective assimilation doctrine as a recognized form of voluntary integration. Second, 2 of the station's external communication arrays experienced simultaneous technical failures. The official diagnostic attributed it to radiation interference from a nearby stellar event. Repairs were estimated at 48 hours. Third, Marcus Webb filed a formal request through the Human Integration Program Liaison Office to attend the public gallery for the following day's session. This was unusual. Human service personnel were technically permitted to observe public sessions, but almost none ever did. The request was processed and approved by a junior protocol officer who didn't flag it for review. I learned about all 3 things at roughly the same time, on the evening of the second day. And something shifted in my mind, a new configuration forming from pieces I hadn't realized were connected. I went looking for Marcus. I found him in the service canteen on sublevel 2. He was eating alone, a common sight, I realized. Marcus almost always ate alone, working through what appeared to be a standard human ration pack with the methodical efficiency of someone eating for function rather than pleasure. He had a battered personal data device on the table beside his tray, and he was reading something on it. When I approached, he looked up with the kind of expression that showed he had heard me coming long before I arrived. "You placed something on the relay conduit bundle in the observation gallery maintenance walkway," I said. I hadn't planned to be that direct. It just came out. Marcus looked at me for a moment. His expression didn't change the way I expected it to, no surprise, no alarm, no guilt. Just a kind of careful assessment. "You saw that," he said, not a question. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his data device and slid it across the table to me. On the screen was a schematic, a detailed schematic, of the Convergence Station's entire internal communication network, cross-referenced with the Vreth delegation's known movement patterns and the Peacekeeping Force's security rotation schedule. I stared at it for a long time. "You've been building this," I said. "For about 2 years," he said. "Why?" He looked at me in a way I still find difficult to describe. It wasn't contempt exactly. It wasn't the patient condescension of a teacher with a slow student exactly. It was something more like sorrow, the kind of sorrow that comes from having understood something important and being unable to share it with anyone who could act on it. Because someone was going to come here eventually who didn't want a diplomatic solution, he said. And when they did, someone needed to know how this station actually worked. He reached over and tapped something on the data device. A second layer of the schematic appeared, overlaid in red, showing 14 specific points throughout the station. The Vreth fleet has 17 capital ships, Marcus said. Standard Vreth military doctrine in a coercive diplomatic operation uses what they call the Greticall formation approach. The fleet positions to block retreat routes, while the ground delegation either secures concessions or provokes an incident that justifies escalation. The diplomatic ground team functions as bait. They don't care about the bait. He paused. The station's external arrays are down, which means right now the Council can't broadcast to its member worlds. Can't call for reinforcement. Can't even confirm to the outer rim that this facility is still functioning normally. That's not a coincidence. You took down the arrays, I said. No, he said. The Vreth did. I've been tracing the signal interference pattern for the last 18 hours. It's not stellar radiation. It's a low-frequency disruptor wave emanating from 3 of their escort vessels. Standard Vreth doctrine pre-kinetic phase. They're cutting communications before they make their final move. The food in front of him had gone cold. He hadn't touched it in several minutes. What is their final move? I asked. Tomorrow's session, he said. The expanded demands are designed to be rejected. When the Council rejects them, the delegation will initiate a formal hostility declaration under Vreth law, which makes the station and everyone in it a war prize. The fleet moves in. The garrison here can't stop it. He looked at me steadily. The Council has about 20 hours. I sat down. My legs had made the decision before my mind caught up. And the thing you placed on the relay conduit, I said, is a backdoor bypass unit, he said. Civilian grade. I built it from components sourced from maintenance supply requisitions over 8 months. If the station's communication network gets locked down or jammed, which it will tomorrow, when the delegation initiates the hostility declaration, that unit reroutes the primary relay through a secondary path that runs outside the Vreth's interference frequency range. He held my gaze, long enough to send one full-spectrum broadcast to every Council world within 6 light hours, and more importantly, to the Ardent Covenant. I knew that name. Everyone in the Council knew that name, though it was rarely spoken at diplomatic facilities. The Ardent Covenant was the Galactic Council's strategic response armada, a fleet assembled years ago as a last-resort deterrent, kept at dispersed positions throughout Council space precisely so that it could never be blockaded at a single point. 11 days away at standard transit. 2 days away at emergency fold jump protocol. The fold jump protocol requires a direct threat level broadcast from a recognized Council facility, I said slowly. Yes, Marcus said, which the station currently cannot generate because the external arrays are compromised. He tapped the schematic. The bypass unit changes that. I stared at him, at this man who swept floors, at this man whose name appeared in official station logs as the bipedal maintenance unit. At this man who had spent 2 years quietly building a contingency plan for a crisis that the entire diplomatic apparatus of the Galactic Council had failed to anticipate. Why didn't you tell anyone? I said. Why didn't you bring this to Administrator Drail 9? To the Peacekeeping Force Commander? To... I did, Marcus said very quietly. And the way he said those 2 words stopped me completely. 8 months ago, he said, I requested a formal meeting with Administrator Drail 9 to discuss what I described as potential security vulnerabilities in the station's communication architecture relative to observed Vreth tactical patterns. I was told that human service personnel were not cleared to participate in security assessments, and that my concerns had been noted. He paused. 6 months ago, I submitted a written assessment through the Human Integration Program Liaison Office. 4 pages. I had to write it on personal time, on my own data device, because service personnel don't have access to official documentation systems. The assessment outlined the communication disruption scenario, The Vreth fleet positioning pattern I had observed through the external viewport records I could access as part of my atmospheric filter maintenance duties, and the projected timeline. He paused again. I received an automated acknowledgement, nothing else. 3 months ago, he continued, I approached the peacekeeping force duty officer directly, verbally, in the corridor outside the garrison quarters on Sector 4. I told him I had observed what appeared to be coordinated Vreth fleet movements consistent with a pre-engagement positioning pattern. He told me to return to my assigned work area. The canteen was very quiet. Nobody listened, I said. Nobody listened, Marcus confirmed. He said it without bitterness. Just as a fact, the way you state the temperature of a room. And I understood then, sitting in that small, low-ceilinged service canteen, at a table designed for species slightly smaller than me, looking at a human who was maybe a third of my height and probably a 12th of my mass, I understood what we had done. Not through malice, not through conspiracy, but through something quieter and in some ways worse. We had looked at him and decided, before he ever spoke, before he ever acted, before he ever demonstrated anything at all, we had decided he had nothing worth hearing. And so we had never listened. What do you need from me? I asked. Marcus looked at me for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the beginning of something that recognized what I had just offered. I need access to 3 places I can't reach alone, he said. The Central Power Distribution Hub on Sublevel 7, the Peacekeeping Force Garrison Command Terminal on Sector 4, and the Main Session Hall's Atmospheric Control Junction on Sublevel 3. What for? The power hub is where I need to be when the delegation initiates the hostility declaration tomorrow, he said. The bypass unit will reroute communications, but the Vreth will detect the rerouting within about 3 minutes. When they do, they'll attempt to cut the station's primary power to the communication systems, standard doctrine. They'll use their ground delegation to access the station's main junction remotely through the diplomatic suite's hardline terminals. I need to be at the power hub to prevent that. What happens at the Garrison Command Terminal? The Peacekeeping Force commander needs to receive the tactical assessment directly from his own systems, not from a human maintenance worker in a corridor, Marcus said. If I can get the assessment into the garrison's official intelligence feed, he has to act on it. That's his protocol. He can ignore me. He cannot ignore his own command terminal. And the atmospheric control junction. Marcus's expression changed slightly. The session hall runs on a closed atmospheric loop, he said. The Vreth are acclimatized to a different atmospheric composition than most council species. If the delegation initiates the hostility declaration and the situation becomes kinetic before the Ardent Covenant can respond, I need a way to change the game inside the hall itself. He looked at me steadily. The atmospheric junction gives me options, he said. I'd rather not use them, but I need them ready. I thought about this. You've planned for a scenario in which you're the only line of defense, I said. I've planned for a scenario in which everything else fails, he said. Which is different? He picked up his food, started eating again methodically, because it needed to be done and there was no reason to let it go to waste. I'm going to need to be in 3 places very quickly, he said between bites practically. I move faster in the service corridors, but some of those access points require clearance I don't have. He looked at me. You have clearance for all 3 locations, he said. And that was it. That was the whole ask. He wasn't asking me to fight anyone. He wasn't asking me to do anything that crossed a line or broke a law or violated my oath to the administrative core. He was asking me to open 3 doors. All right, I said. He nodded once, like it was settled. Then he finished his meal. Part 2, the session. The morning of the formal session was very calm, in the way that the air gets very calm before a pressure system breaks. I had spent the night doing what I was supposed to be doing, logistics coordination for the Vorathan delegation, and also doing what Marcus had asked me to do, which was using my administrative access to create maintenance work orders for 3 specific locations. Work orders which would allow Marcus to be in those locations without triggering any security flags. I had also, very quietly, using a personal channel that didn't route through the station's main communication system, sent a message to Administrator Drail 9. I told him about Marcus, about the assessment, about the bypass unit, about the fleet positioning. I told him everything Marcus had told me, in plain language, without diplomatic softening. I received no response. The session was scheduled to begin at the 3rd station hour. At the 2nd station hour, Marcus disappeared into the service corridor network. I went to the observation gallery. The session hall at full attendance is an extraordinary sight. 3,000 seats arranged in concentric arcs around a central floor space, with the council's full deliberative apparatus, translation systems, procedural display screens, atmospheric calibration nodes for each species zone, humming in perfect coordination. The art installations on the upper walls rotate slowly, displaying the flags and symbols of every member species in a constant silent celebration of the Accord's existence. The Vreth delegation sat at the observers' table on the main floor. Gorthak and Maul looked like he had slept very well. Administrator Drail 9 opened the session with the formal procedural language. He looked tired. His secondary eyes, the ones Vorathan administrators keep focused on peripheral threats, were very active. Someone had told him something, or he had finally read my message. Or perhaps in the long night he had simply done his own math. The session moved through its preliminary phases with the deliberate slowness of a process designed for consensus. Reports, acknowledgements, procedural motions. Then the Vreth delegation was recognized. Gorthak and Maul stood. He was 3 meters tall and wearing ceremonial armor, and his jaw plates were spread wide, and his bioluminescent organs were blazing cold blue. "The Vreth hegemony," he said, in that voice that sounded like tectonic plates deciding something, "has concluded that the Galactic Accord lacks the developmental maturity to honor the terms of observer status engagement. Under Vreth hegemony law, protocol, Gretakal Khan." And that's when the lights changed. Not all the lights, not a blackout, just a shift, a slight dimming followed by a stabilization lasting maybe 2 seconds. Later, I would understand what that 2 seconds meant. In that 2 seconds, Marcus Webb was in the power distribution hub on sublevel 7, and he had done something very precise to a specific relay junction that prevented the Vreth diplomatic suite's hardline terminals from accessing the station's primary communication systems. Gorthak and Maul stopped speaking. Just for a moment, the interruption was small enough that it might have been atmospheric calibration. His translator unit blinked. Then he continued. "Protocol Gretakal Khan is hereby initiated. This station and its personnel are formally designated as..." The station's emergency broadcast system activated. Not the external arrays, those were still down, but the internal broadcast system, which ran on a completely separate circuit that didn't interface with the external arrays at all, and which the Vreth had not considered worth disrupting. And through every speaker in every room on every level of the convergence station, a voice spoke. It was a human voice, clear, flat, without drama. "This is an emergency notification generated from Convergence Station's primary intelligence assessment system. All peacekeeping force personnel and council administrative staff are advised of the following. The Vreth hegemony fleet currently in holding position at the station's outer defensive perimeter is engaged in pre-engagement tactical positioning consistent with Vreth military doctrine protocol Gretakal Khan. Communication disruption from 3 escort vessels is confirmed. Fleet movement toward station is projected to initiate within the next 40 minutes. This assessment is transmitted simultaneously to the Ardent Covenant Strategic Response Armada on Emergency Fold Jump Authorization. Time stamped and recorded. Station systems acknowledge." Silence. 3,000 beings in that hall, and not one sound. Then Gorthak and Maul looked up at the broadcast system speakers with an expression that translated across species barriers with perfect clarity. He was surprised. He had not expected this. For the first time since his delegation arrived, Commander Gorthak and Maul of the Vreth hegemony was operating outside his plan. What happened in the next 6 minutes I will try to describe as accurately as I can, but I want to be honest. Some of it I saw directly, some of it was reconstructed from the station's internal monitoring records later, and some of it I have only from Marcus's own account, told to me afterward in the same flat, practical voice he used for everything. Gorthak and Maul turned to his 6-member delegation. and gave a command in Vreth dialect that translated as something between lockdown and execute contingency. Two members of the delegation moved toward the hall's main floor terminal array, the diplomatic hardline access points that, under normal circumstances, are used for translation support and procedural record access. The terminals didn't respond. The relay junction Marcus had modified in the power hub had isolated those terminals from the station's primary systems. The Vreth delegation's remote access to the communication network, the access they needed to jam the bypass unit's broadcast and cut power to the secondary relay, was gone. Gorthakin Mall made a sound that his translator unit didn't render. Some things don't translate. Then he looked at the peacekeeping force sentinels at the hall's entrance. There were 12 of them. They had, in the last 60 seconds, received the tactical assessment through their command terminals, the same assessment that Marcus had loaded into the garrison's intelligence feed the night before, using the administrative access I had provided. Their duty protocol was clear. A confirmed threat-level broadcast from a recognized council facility required immediate defensive posture. The 12 Sentinels were not the Ardent Covenant. They were internal security force, rated for their job, not for a fight with 7 Vreth in ceremonial armor. But they stepped forward, and in the gallery above, I watched Gorthakin Mall calculate the same thing I was calculating, that this situation had moved beyond what his plan had prepared for, that the element of surprise was gone, that the fleet was still 40 minutes out, and the Ardent Covenant's fold jump response time was. The broadcast had gone out 40 seconds ago. The Ardent Covenant's fastest fold-capable vessels could cover 6 light hours in. In the math that Gorthakin Mall was doing right now in his enormous head, something wasn't adding up correctly for him. And then Marcus Webb walked through the service door on the south side of the main hall. I want to be precise about this, because I think precision matters here. He didn't walk in like a warrior. He didn't walk in like a hero. He walked in like someone who had a job to finish and was going to finish it. He was still wearing his service uniform. Gray, unadorned, yellow accord patch on his left shoulder. He had his tool satchel over one shoulder. He was maybe 180 centimeters tall, which is small by any interspecies metric. And he looked, at first, from where I was sitting, almost comically ordinary against the scale of that hall, against the towering Vreth delegation, against the weight of 3,000 beings watching in absolute silence. He walked to the center of the floor. He stopped approximately 8 meters from Gorthakin Mall. He looked up at the Vreth commander with the same expression I had seen him use when calculating threat assessments in Pavilion 3, not anger, not fear, something more like focused recognition. The look of someone who has already worked out what comes next and is simply moving through the steps. The bypass broadcast went out 90 seconds ago, Marcus said, in Galactic Standard, in a voice that was very calm. The Ardent Covenant's 3-fold-capable destroyers have a confirmed fold jump response time of 1 hour 40 minutes from a threat-level broadcast. Your fleet's fastest capital ship, at maximum approach velocity from its current position, reaches effective weapons range in 2 hours 12 minutes, which means you're 32 minutes short. He paused. The math doesn't work, he said. It never worked. I've been watching your fleet positioning for 2 years. Gorthakin Mall stared at him. The maintenance pet speaks strategy, Gorthakin Mall said very slowly. The maintenance human, Marcus said, did your homework for you. Your doctrine assumes communication blackout before fleet engagement. The blackout failed. Everything downstream of that failure your doctrine doesn't cover. He held the commander's gaze. You have one option that doesn't end with your fleet interdicted by the Ardent Covenant. You stand down. You withdraw the hostility declaration. You return your fleet to the outer perimeter. And then the council decides what comes next. The hall was so quiet I could hear the atmospheric processors. Gorthakin Mall looked at this human, this small, gray-uniformed human with a tool satchel, and I watched something move across the Vreth commander's face. Something I had never seen there before. Not respect, not yet. Something that comes before respect, a kind of shocked recalibration. The moment when a mind that has organized the world in one configuration is forced to begin organizing it differently. You, Gorthakin Mall said, you are a servant, you clean floors. I do clean floors, Marcus agreed. I also spent 2 years learning how this station works while everyone assumed I wasn't paying attention. A beat. I was paying attention, he said. What happened next will be in the official records of the Galactic Convergence Station as a successful de-escalation of the Vreth Observer crisis, achieved through coordinated peacekeeping force and administrative action. That's the official version. Here is what actually happened. Gorthak and Maul stood in the center of that hall for 43 seconds. I counted them, looking at Marcus Webb. Then he looked at the 12 peacekeeping force sentinels who had formed a defensive arc around the hall's exit points. Then at the 3,000 beings in the seats above, every one of them watching. Then back at Marcus. He made a sound, a long, low sound, below the range of most species' comfortable hearing, that his translator unit rendered as a single word. Acknowledged. He reached up and touched a contact point on his ceremonial armor. A status light on the armor's chest plate went from blue to amber. Across the station, in the communication room where the Vreth delegation's signal relay was housed, the directional disruptor wave ceased. In orbit, the 17 capital ships of the Vreth hegemony fleet held position. They did not advance. Marcus nodded once, then he turned and walked back toward the service door. He was almost there when Gorthak and Maul spoke again. "Human," he said. Marcus stopped, turned. "What is your designation?" Gorthak and Maul said. The Vreth word he used, the formal term he used, the respectful register. It isn't the word you use for a servant. It's the word you use for someone whose name you want to know because you intend to remember it. Marcus looked at him for a moment. "Webb," he said. "Marcus Webb." He pushed open the service door and was gone. Part 3 after. The Ardent Covenant's 3-fold capable destroyers arrived 1 hour and 38 minutes after the broadcast went out. They took up position between the Vreth fleet and the station without firing a shot. Negotiations regarding the Vreth hegemony's observer status and the legal consequences of Protocol Greta Kalkan initiation began 48 hours later. Those negotiations lasted 4 months. I won't go into the details here. What matters for this account is what happened to Marcus during those 4 months and what happened after. In the immediate aftermath of the session, there was a period of about 3 hours during which nobody at the administrative level seemed to know quite what to do with Marcus Webb. He had technically violated several human integration program regulations. Service personnel were prohibited from accessing station systems beyond their designated maintenance scope. The bypass unit he had built was constructed from components sourced through maintenance requisitions, technically theft of station property, though the value was negligible. He had entered the main session hall during a formal session without authorization. Administrator Drail 9 reviewed the list of violations. Then he looked at the list of what Marcus had accomplished. Then he filed the violations list in a location where it would not be easily found. I went to find Marcus the same evening. He was in the service canteen on sublevel 2, eating again at the same table as before. The same methodical way of working through a meal as something that needed doing. I sat down across from him. "The Ardent Covenant is in position," I said. "I know," he said. "Administrator Drail 9 wants to meet with you tomorrow." I figured he would. "He's going to ask you a lot of questions." Marcus looked up from his tray. "About what I did." "About what you are," I said. He considered this. "I'm what I was before any of this," he said. "That hasn't changed." "It has changed," I said. "How we see you has changed." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not the same thing," he said. He was right. And that was a harder truth than anything else that had happened in the past 24 hours. That we hadn't seen him clearly before, and that our finally seeing him clearly wasn't some gift we were giving him. It was just us catching up to something that had always been true. "You knew," I said. "All along you knew what you were capable of, and you waited." He looked at me. There was something in his expression I'm still not sure I have the right word for. "I wasn't waiting for a chance to be seen," he said. "I was waiting for the moment when what I could do would actually matter. Those are different things." He picked up his drink, set it down, seemed to be deciding something. "On Earth," he said, "we have how it's complicated to translate, a concept. The idea that the most important battles aren't the ones you fight, they're the ones you prevent. That sometimes the whole point of being ready is so that you never have to use it. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't want today to happen, he said. I wanted none of today to be necessary. I'd have been happy to keep sweeping floors for 30 more years if it meant the Vreth never showed up. But they did, I said. But they did, he agreed. The formal inquiry into the Vreth crisis took 3 weeks. Marcus testified on the 7th day. I was in the room. I watched the council's investigative panel, 7 senior members, 4 of whom had never spoken to a human before, try to process what they were looking at. This small, quiet, gray-uniformed person, who had built a 2-year contingency plan in the margins of a cleaning shift. They asked him technical questions. He answered them. They asked him about his background, which was where things got complicated. Marcus Webb, it turned out, had a history that the Human Integration Program's intake processing had, in Administrator Drail 9 later words, failed to adequately contextualize. Before joining the integration program, Marcus Webb had served for 12 years in the Earth Coalition's Strategic Defense Intelligence Division. His specialization was what the Coalition called Infrastructure Vulnerability Assessment, analyzing complex systems to identify the points where small, precisely applied interventions could produce large-scale effects. He had been recruited into the integration program because he spoke 4 languages and had listed his current occupation as facilities maintenance consultant. He had not lied. He had simply answered the questions as asked. The intake process had not asked whether he had spent a decade and a half mapping the exploitable weaknesses of fortified military and diplomatic installations across Earth's contested territories. Nobody had thought to ask that of a maintenance worker. The panel was silent for a long time after this information was presented. Then one of the senior members, a Drezari named Velkaras, who was one of the older members of the council and had spent 60 years in Accord diplomacy, spoke. When you arrived at this station, she said, you immediately began conducting infrastructure vulnerability assessment. Yes, Marcus said, as you would have for any assignment. Yes, and when you identified the Vreth threat scenario. Approximately 14 months in, Marcus said. You attempted to report it through official channels. 4 times, Marcus said, in 3 different formats. And when those reports were not acted upon, Velkaras said slowly, you continued your assessment, and you built contingencies. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. How many contingencies? She said. Marcus reached into his tool satchel and placed 7 data slates on the table in front of the panel. 7 primary scenarios, he said. 23 secondary variants. I can walk through all of them if that would be useful. The panel looked at the data slates. Then Velkaras did something that surprised me. She said, Mr. Webb, has the station been secure since you arrived in your assessment? Marcus thought about this. No, he said, but it's been more secure than it would have been otherwise. She nodded slowly. Because you were here, she said. Because someone was paying attention, Marcus said. The formal outcome of the inquiry included several recommendations. The Human Integration Program's intake and assignment processes were to be comprehensively reviewed. Station security protocols were to be updated to include provisions for emerging species intelligence contributions. A formal acknowledgement was to be entered into the Accord record noting that the timely intervention of human service personnel Marcus Webb in the Vreth Observer crisis preserved the operational continuity of the Convergence Station. That language, the timely intervention, was the Council's way of formally saying what it struggled to say more directly. There was also a private conversation between Administrator Drail 9 and Marcus in Drail 9 office that I was not present for. I know only what Drail 9 told me afterward. He had offered Marcus a formal apology for the dismissal of his earlier reports. Marcus had accepted it simply, without drama, without leveraging it, without saying anything that made Drail 9 feel worse or better than he deserved to feel. Then Marcus had asked if he could return to his regular duties. Drail 9 had said that his duties were, he imagined, going to change somewhat. Marcus had said that was probably fine. But he'd like to finish polishing the Sector 2 corridors first because he'd been in the middle of that when everything happened, and it had been bothering him. The Vreth hegemony did not receive provisional membership. What they received, after 4 months of negotiation backed by the Ardent Covenant's continued presence, was a formal framework agreement that required independent monitoring of their protective assimilation processes and created a set of binding standards, the first such standards that applied to the Vreth for the treatment of incorporated species. It was not perfect. It was not justice, not yet, not for the 12-star systems that had already been absorbed. But it was a line, a real one with teeth. Gorthak and Maul signed it himself, in a formal session in the same hall where everything had happened. And at one point during that ceremony, I saw his gaze move to the service corridor door on the south side of the hall, hold there for a moment, then return to the documents in front of him. Marcus Webb was formally reclassified within the Human Integration Program 6 weeks after the crisis. His new official designation was Strategic Infrastructure Analyst, Convergence Station, Grade 1. It was, as far as anyone could determine, the first time a human had held a Grade 1 analyst position in any Galactic Accord facility. He kept his old service uniform for a while. I saw him in the corridors wearing it, weeks after the new designation. When I mentioned it, he said the new uniform was fine, but the old one had useful pockets. That was Marcus. There's one more thing I want to tell you. About 3 months after the crisis, I was in the Sector 2 maintenance corridor, the one Marcus had been polishing when everything started, and I ran into him coming the other direction. He had his new analyst's data slate in one hand, but he'd also stopped to pick up a cleaning cloth that had fallen from a supply cart and was tucking it back in its proper slot with the automatic, unconscious tidiness of someone who had done that kind of thing for 3 years. We stopped. "How's the new role?" I asked. "Strange," he said. "People listen now." There was something complicated in the way he said it. "Is that good?" I asked. He thought about it for a genuine moment. "It's good that things get done," he said. He paused. "It's strange that that's what it took. For people to listen, that's what had to happen first." He looked at the corridor around him, the luminite flooring, the smooth dramite walls, the atmospheric calibration nodes spaced along the ceiling. "I knew this station better when I was nobody," he said. "Because when you're nobody, you can't rely on anyone else seeing what you see, so you have to see everything, you have to know everything. You have to be ready for everything by yourself in case you're the only one there when it matters." He was quiet for a moment. "Most of the time nothing happens," he said. "Most of the time you're just sweeping floors, and that's fine. That's the goal. That's what it looks like when it's working." He looked at me. "The war god thing," he said, and there was a very faint, dry kind of humor in his voice that I had started to recognize over the past months. "That's the myth. The truth is just someone who paid attention for a long time and was ready when it counted." He put the analyst's data slate under his arm and turned to go. "Marcus," I said. He looked back. "The Drezari cultural liaison," I said. "The one in Pavilion 3, when the Vreth cornered him, you saw that." "Yes," he said. "That was the moment you made your decision, wasn't it? That the contingency plan wasn't just academic, that you were going to actually use it." He was quiet for a moment. "Someone had to," he said. And he walked away down the corridor. I have been an administrator of the Galactic Accord for 34 years since those events. I have worked at 3 different facilities, been part of 11 major diplomatic processes, and served on 2 special advisory councils. In all of that time, I have thought about Marcus Webb more than I have thought about almost anything else. Not about the crisis, not about the tactical brilliance of what he did, or the quiet precision of the contingency plan, or the moment in the session hall when Gorthak and Maul said his name in the respectful register. I think about the 14 months before any of that. The Marcus Webb who swept floors and watched and wrote a 4-page report that went into an automated acknowledgement system and came out the other side as nothing. The Marcus Webb who stopped at an emergency communication panel in Pavilion 3 and did a threat assessment in 2 seconds, and then kept pushing his cart and said nothing to anyone because he had already learned what happened when he did. I think about what it means to know things that no one will hear. And I think about the species, my species, all our species, who looked at a human with a cleaning cart and decided in the first moment of seeing him that there was nothing there worth listening to. We have a saying on Voritha Prime: you can measure the intelligence of a civilization by how it treats the things it considers beneath it. I still think that's wisdom, but I think now I understand it differently. It isn't measuring whether we're kind to things beneath us. It's asking whether we even know what's beneath us, whether our categories, servant, pet, maintenance unit, bipedal cleaning apparatus, are accurate, whether the things we've decided don't matter actually don't matter, whether we might be wrong. Marcus Webb swept floors for 3 years, and while he swept them, he saved us. Not because he was some exceptional aberration, but because he was a human, doing what humans do when they're paying attention and nobody's watching and everything might matter, which is everything. That's the thing none of us understood, not really, not until it was almost too late. They never stop. They never stop watching and thinking and building and preparing and caring, even when every signal we send them says your caring doesn't count here. You are beneath us. Your eyes see nothing we need. Even then, especially then, I heard years later that Marcus eventually left the Convergence Station. He had been offered a position with the Accord's new Strategic Infrastructure Review Division, a body created largely because of what happened with the Vreth crisis, designed to ensure that someone was always paying attention to the things that everyone else assumed didn't need watching. He took the position. He was gone within a year. The official record says he resigned to pursue other opportunities. The unofficial account from someone who had worked with him says he left because they had started decorating his office and giving him a staff and holding meetings about his assessments before implementing them. And somewhere in all that, he'd stopped being able to see the station clearly. You stop seeing it, he apparently said, when everyone's watching you see it. I believe that. And somewhere right now, in some facility in the spiral arm, in some diplomatic hub, some military installation, some deep space research platform, I believe there is someone in a gray service uniform pushing a cleaning cart down a corridor that everyone else walks through without thinking. And that person is paying attention. And they are ready. And we will never know it until we need it. And on that day, we will call it a miracle. It was never a miracle. It was just someone doing the work.